You're listening to the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on the Old Testament historical books. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders. I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, who's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day.
All right, here. This one's kind of an interesting one, I think. You have a play on words. So in this one, in second, it'll be in both of them. But in First Chronicles 1:19, it says there were two sons born to Eber. The name of the first was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. So it took the word Peleg and used it as a play on words, because the earth in his days the earth was divided here. So it's this is something you'd never catch in English, but because of the Hebrew, you can actually see the relationship between the words. And then the other thing I wanted to show you, it talks about his two sons, and so we got to the divided here, and his brother's name was Joktan. So we've got, and Genesis 10:25 actually tells us about Heber having two sons. One is Peleg and one's Joktan. What it's going to do next, it's going to show us, okay, so here's the Genesis 25, okay, Peleg and Joktan, and then it goes through Joktan's line. So it goes down, and I stopped it at verse 26. But then in chapter 11, it repeats Eber and his, he had two sons. One was Peleg, and the other one was, where's it, Joktan? Okay. But this time it's going to go down, and it's going to follow Peleg down. And I'll show you the next one. So here's what we've got. We've got Eber. There's Peleg, his first son. Here's Joktan, his second son. Then it talks about Joktan, and it goes down through this family line to get to Abraham. So it's So what happened is it looks like the line is split. One of them is Peleg, and that one kind of peters out. It goes through its sons and stuff like that, but then it stops. Yeah. Then it picks it up another chapter later, goes to Joktan and goes down to Abraham. So my guess is that what it wanted to do is it wanted to make sure we knew that there was a split in Eber's line, and that the one we're going to follow is Joktan's line all the way down to Abraham. So I thought that one is kind of neat, because we don't see that very often. And so we saw two things. We saw a play on the name, the earth being divided. And then we saw...
Because Peleg... Is Peleg division or divide? Is that kind of the base meaning of that?
Well, the noun just means, there's just a name, but it can be used as a verb, and it means to divide.
Yeah, gotcha.
So it's kind of neat. I thought...
It's very interesting,
We don't see that very often, so I thought that would be fun for you. All right.
Yeah, that was super neat.
All right.
And that tells us what passage, what book of the Bible we're looking at today.
We're now in Chronicles. Sorry about that.
That's right. Yeah.
This one I wanted to show you. This is my chart for the book of Chronicles. But what you've got there is the first 9 chapters are all genealogies. Not very many books start out with, Genesis has your genealogies. Yeah. But once you get past that, you usually don't see, at least not this long a one. But Chronicles, I think, is trying to take us all the way back to the beginning with the patriarchs, and then follow us through all the way through to Return of the Exiles. So it's given us that history there. And so 9 chapters of genealogy. If you thought that some of the other law books were hard, just look at this. Genealogy is probably pretty boring.
Well, and a lot of times we think of like the beginning of the Gospels. Yeah. Some of those genealogies, they seem so long. Like, just like, let's just get to the actual thing here. But 9 chapters, that's the real deal.
This one's kind of interesting, because if you know that Chronicles is written about 400 BC, if you know that, then it puts the whole history kind of in a different perspective. So this is basically at the end of the biblical text, or the Old Testament text, right? Because 400 is about the latest you've got. So basically it goes through giving you that genealogy, and then it's going to tell you about some of the highlights, like David's reign is going to be a highlight. It's going to spend like 10 chapters on David. Then it's going to spend another 9 or 10 chapters on Solomon. Those two big ones. And then the rest of it is going to be all the kings of Judah. There's not a king of Israel mentioned. And my guess is, in his mind, that's not important. The important thing for the people to know in the post-exilic time period was that God had a plan. And he's gone through history, and he's pulling out the important kings and then takes them through Judah and says, you know what, guys, God's still got a plan for you. And that seems to be what's going on here.
So is that how you'd summarize Chronicles? Like it's kind of a retelling of their history
only
with the specific purpose of showing
that's it.
God's hand in this.
Yeah. And to show them that God's still got a plan for them. Yeah. Because you can imagine after 400 B, or even after the exile, they're thinking, man, does God care about us anymore? And so I'm sure that's what Chronicles was written for.
Yeah.
So that's our big picture anyway. All right. The history that's talked about is kind of neat because it actually does two things. It talks about when God takes the people into captivity, it's really clear that it's the leaders that go, the rich people, the people that have ripped off the poor people. In actual fact, the poor people, I don't know if you remember, but the prophets keep blasting the rich people for stealing the poor people's land. And what this is going to do is what it shows us is that God can punish the rich people the most, and the ones that are most responsible are going to be punished the most. If you were a poor person in the Babylonian exile when it happened, you were actually better off than ever. You know, these rich people had taken your land. You now have your land back. Because for the Babylonians, they needed somebody to take care of the land and continue to keep the money coming in and stuff like that. And it was the leaders and stuff like that had gone against Babylon. So in their minds, the poor people were fine. They didn't actually hadn't done anything against them. And then, so that's the first part of the story. I don't know if you know Paul Harvey. He used to say, page 2. So on page 2, the second part of it is that when the Israelites come back from the Babylonian captivity, the ones that come back are the ones that care most about God. And the reason is, the only reason they were going to come back was they were going to come back to a destroyed land, give up all the land that they had back in Babylon. Because remember, they'd been there for, 70 years, or some of them certainly had been there almost that long. And so we've got people living, like Daniel had been there that long. So they've been there for a long time. They had gained land and families and stuff like that. They had to give up a lot of that stuff to come back. And the only reason you do that is if you cared enough about the temple and what you didn't have in Babylon, that you would come back and to build a temple. Now, not many people were willing to do that, but the ones that did, you knew cared enough about God. So not only what he did is he punished the ones that deserved it the most, he also brought a remnant back from Babylon that were now what we call a righteous remnant. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's amazing, and the way he did it was by blessing their socks off. You know, he took them to Babylon, gave them all the stuff they needed and everything like that. The only ones that want to come back are the ones that actually care enough about him to do it.
Right.
So I think that's an amazing story. I just sit back.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, I just sit back and go, wow, what an amazing God.
Well, and we had hints of that, especially like when we were looking through Isaiah, like this is something that's going to happen, right? There's going to be kind of this culling down to the righteous remnant, and they'll come back and they're going to, God's going to help them persist, but it's a cool way to see how it actually plays out,
Yeah, it's amazing. All right. The next section is the chronicler uses history to teach theology. Okay. And his apologetic history of Israel is intended to encourage encourage hope in the post-exilic period when the nation of Israel is at a very low period. They get back to the land and start rebuilding the temple, but it takes about 2 years and they get discouraged, wondering, where's God? The people of the land didn't want them to rebuild, so they come and pick on him and even, even tried to many times get him to stop. So so it was interesting. It's what's going on there is that God's letting them know that there's that point in history, they're probably really discouraged, wondering what's going on. Here comes the book of Chronicles to tell them, wait a minute, look what God's done in the past for you. And look what here's what he's got for you. So it highlights all those good kings, highlights David and the temple, especially. And so it's kind of interesting what he's doing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Key ideas are going to be retelling the past to provide encouragement in the present. An idealization of David and Solomon for sure. And then centrality of worship, because it spends a lot of time on the building of the temple. Okay. And that priests and Levites should be community leaders, so that they should be the ones, running the show, so that they can remember the kings had done a really poor job. And so I think this is trying to push that. Now we want the priests to do their job and teach the people. So it makes sense.
For sure.
Yeah. Now, some of them, Chronicles, remember, you've got now a retelling of the story, basically, right? So you got basically material that's taken over almost directly. So I've got a passage here, First Chronicles 19 and 2 Samuel 10 is almost exactly the same. So there's some of that. There's some that it's modified, and sometimes for theological reasons. Like for 2 Samuel 24:1 says, now again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, go and number Israel and Judah. Now, what's interesting is, remember, Samuel was written before Chronicles. So I'm going to, and then look what Chronicles says pretty much about that same context in 1 Chronicles 21:1. Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So notice it's pretty clear now the Satan or Satan is the one doing it, not the Lord. Right. See, I think what's happened is that they've got, in their development of their theology, they've got it far enough by the 400s to now know that there's a person that goes against God and that. But by Samuel time, I would argue they didn't have that developed concept yet. So by this time he can modify it, because now they've got a better theology understanding that it was actually Satan doing it and not the anger of the Lord. Now, I would say they're both correct. God oversees all of this, so he knows what Satan's doing and all that, and he can control it. But it seems like to me they have a more specific understanding of it by that time.
Sure. Yeah.
So I thought that's helpful. Okay, and then
it is helpful. Yeah.
And then number 3, sometimes they're replaced by different stories. Now, this one is not a big passage, but if you look at the yellow part here, what's happened is added a whole virtual verse that is not in the King's passage. So it's talking about Jehoshabath, the daughter of King Joram, the wife of Jehoiada, the priest, and she was a sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah so that he would not be put to death. So it was interesting because this passage, notice it says almost everything over there except that verse. So it can be modified or replaced by a different version or stuff like that. That could be the third thing that happens. Sometimes there's even larger portions, like the whole northern kingdom is left out of the Chronicles. So that's a big one. Yeah. And then sometimes it includes large portions that were not in Chronicles. So, or not in Kings. I mean,
not in Samuel.
Yeah. Kings. Chronicles, this whole passage in chapter 22, 1-7 is not in the Samuel or the King's passage. So it's interesting. The author can pick and choose the kind of things that he wants in his story. And so, it's looks like he's definitely got a reason for doing what he's doing.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So Chronicles follows Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible. Almost historically, that would be logical progression. The English order follows the Septuagint. And so, not exactly sure why the Septuagint is different, but it is. In Hebrew, the title is the words of the days. And in Greek, the Greek title is the things omitted. So, so the Septuagint, in their mind, they saw these as a separate work of things that just hadn't got put in the first one. but that's not really accurate because most of the stuff is there.
Right.
So
yeah.
And then Chronicles centers on the theological history of Israel. Like a lot of times it'll explain what God's doing. And so, and where in Kings and Samuel, sometimes it'll just give the bare history, the events of what happened. Chronicles will often say why God was doing that. Yeah. Okay. We don't know what who the author is, but generally it's tradition says that Ezra the scribe did it. And that does make a lot of sense because that would mean the history would continue. And so it makes some sense. So I think traditionally it's probably good, very logical. Yeah. And then the date's about 400 BC, especially if you use the Zerubbabel's genealogy, which goes down to about 406 BC. So that's where we get the date from it. It wouldn't have put that in there if they didn't know what the genealogy was. So my guess is, it's down to about 406, and then that's pretty much the last genealogical thing you get. So that's where we get our date for the book. And it's in chapter 3, not in chapter 9 like you'd expect.
Oh, right, because your genealogies go all the way through.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Okay. It's possible that Israel thought that Zerubbabel, remember, he's the one that brings the people back. So it's possible that they thought that Zerubbabel was going to bring them in the Messianic kingdom. They've been told about it. The prophets were pretty clear. But when that failed, it's possible that the chronicler's theology of hope may have provided the needed encouragement to let them know that God's not done with them. So I think that's what's going on. The second Exodus envisioned by Zechariah was delayed, but not done away with. Okay. Jerusalem would be established as a political capital and religious focal point of the nations. And Zechariah is pretty clear on that. So historically, this book makes perfect sense when you realize what it's doing and why it's there. And the whole purpose for the encouragement is to tell what God's doing through that history. Yeah. So
now, is this a fairly common kind of like a cross scholarship or even like critical scholarship? Is that dating pretty agreed upon, or is that pretty broad?
No, I think most people I think agree that. Now they may take it even further later. Like I assumed it's about 400. Some later scholars take it even later, but I don't think we need to do that. So, But I think it's pretty well agreed upon.
That's interesting. Yeah.
What I try to do here is kind of give you the overview. You can see the chapters 1 through 9, you get the genealogy. Then Chronicles 10 through 2 Chronicles 36, it's talking about the time between David, basically, and the Zedekiah, the last king in Judah. And then Chronicles 36 actually talks about Cyrus's decree. I don't know if we did this, but in at the end of Chronicles, look at Chronicles, the very last verse. Actually, it's the last two verses. So we're at 2 Chronicles 36, verse 22 and 23. And it says it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout his kingdom. Okay, and it keeps going. Look at Ezra chapter 1. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in the order to fulfill the word of the Lord, the mouth of Jeremiah. Notice it's repetition. So two whole verses at the end of Chronicles, and I think it's
basically
and three verses in Ezra. I think that was so that the people would know where to fit the history up. So you've got the Chronicles there. Then it's telling you that now this the book of Ezra fits right into this time period. So it gives you an overlapping time. This is funny, but the old English books used to have a word at the bottom of the page, and then they put in the margin kind of thing. Then you'd go to the next page, and at the top you'd have that same word. The reason you did it so you knew that you didn't lose any pages out of your book.
Sure,
I'm thinking that's what this is for. It's to let you know that Chronicles and Ezra Nehemiah are intended to fit right together. So that repetition.
Yeah.
Remember, these were in scrolls at first, right? So if they're in scrolls, one of the best ways to do that is to know that you've got like a repetition in one part, and then it fits into this next book and starts the same.
Yeah.
So I think it makes a lot of sense. So
yeah, I mean, that certainly, that kind of indicates why maybe they're that order in the Septuagint. Like they just kind of fit together, in a literary sense.
Yeah. So anyway, the Book of Chronicles covers from Adam in its genealogical form all the way to Cyrus's decree. So that's the history. And then history, Israel was an insignificant backwater country through the Persian and Greek periods. It was overshadowed by the superpowers like Persia or Babylon, any of those superpowers. And the Greek religion was challenged by rival temples by the Samaritans, Ahura Mazda, and Greek mystery religion. So it's in a time period when there's a lot of other influences that would cause them to possibly question their theology. And so Chronicles, I think, is written to help them understand that better.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important book. So some people have argued that Chronicles is not as accurate, but and one of the reasons because it omits the Northern Kingdom's history and a totally positive view of David and Solomon, or it modifies material or it adds material. But remember, we've got the 4 Gospels too, right? And they basically tell the same story, but from different perspectives. I think that's what's happening here with Chronicles. You've got a very similar history, but it's written there to give you another perspective, the one that the chronicler wants you to know. One of the things, I've got a quote here from chapter 8, 2 Chronicles 33:18. And here's what it says. Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, even his prayer to his God and the words of the seers who spoke to him in the name of the Lord God of Israel, behold, they are among the records of the kings of Israel. His prayer also, and how God was entreated by him, and all his sins and his unfaithfulness, and the sites on which he built high places and erected the Asherim and the carved images before he humbled himself. Behold, they are written in the records of Hosea, whoever this guy is. So what it's actually, and now I don't know if you know the prayer of Manasseh. Have you ever heard of that, Tyler?
I don't think so.
It's an apocryphal book. And it actually, because if you think about it, Manasseh was the worst or the most wicked king in all Israel, right? Yeah. And he gets sent away to Babylon. The biblical text tells us that.
Right.
But at the end of his life, he ends up coming back. And the question would be, well, what made him come back? And the prayer of Manasseh talks about his repentance and why God would let him come back. Which again, I think it's just an apocryphal story, so I don't think it's authoritative. But the biblical text does actually say that Manasseh prayed to God and talked about all that. And so I'm assuming that that's what gave rise to the prayer of Manasseh, the apocryphal book. They were probably thinking that must have been some amazing prayer if the most wicked king in all of Israel gets to come back. So I think that's probably why we've got that prayer of Manasseh anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Sometimes they say because of the large numbers, but in actual fact, that's not always true. I've got an example here from 2 Samuel where they say that there was 800 slain by this guy that was one of David's mighty men, and Chronicles actually says there was only 300. So my guess is there's probably a textual variant between these two. But I did want you to know that the Chronicles passage is not always the largest.
Yeah. I see.
Yeah. And then I gave you an example here from Samuel and Chronicles where they're both the same. This one was talking about 300 people, and it's pretty much says that in Chronicles.
Right.
So here's a chart that actually shows that there's about, there is not, I'm not questioning that sometimes it's larger. But not always. Sometimes once they're the same, 10 times it's higher, lower 7 times. So there's 19 disagreements, but a good share of them are not always larger. And I'm thinking that probably what happens is that when you've got these numbers, because they were written out, you could have had probably textual variants that changes them or things like that. So I think there's a lot of different possibilities as to why you have different numbers in these places.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I just want to make sure you know that there are differences, but I don't think they're serious.
Yeah.
All right. The compiler picks and chooses the things that he wants to highlight in his message. He's trying to get the message he's trying to get across. He only takes the things that he believes are going to be important for his story of the theology of hope and how to encourage them. The additions do not need to be incorrect. I think, in fact, they're probably true. The question will be, is he just chose different ones either to add or to omit? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
And then 3, could modify statements to highlight theological points. That's where that one place where it says the anger burned, and then it says that Satan did it.
Yep.
And then we got, here's the genealogy. I wanted you to see those. It's not like goes right through the patriarchs. Well, it goes through the patriarchs and Israel's sons, then the family of Judah, then Simeon and Reuben and Gad and Manasseh and Levi. So it's not like a genealogy that goes right through history.
Right.
They're grouped in different ways. And then the last chapter 9 are the returning exiles. So by the time you get to there, it does have the beginning with the patriarchs and ends with the returning exiles. But between there, it's a little different than kind of what you expect. Okay. Yeah. All right. Genealogies were in there to show the election of Israel, I think. David's kingship is definitely a central, and the centrality of the temple is mentioned. Solomon's reign and proper worship of Yahweh. The providential activity of Yahweh in Israel's history. Remember, I told you several times it gives you God's view of why he's doing things. Yeah. And then Judah is the true heir to the covenantal blessings, and Israel is basically a tangent in the chronicler's mind. Yeah. All right. I just wanted you to see this. So it talks of one chapter and basically about Saul's death. So that's all he gets in this. But David's accession is 2 chapters. The return of the ark is 4 chapters. David's conquests are 2 chapters, and then the organization of David's kingdom is 6 chapters. So I mean, you can definitely see that's where it's centering on.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Then we got a few verses of them, telling his farewell and his death.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Faithful worship is really a major part of it. There's a clear emphasis on following the right worship of God and the temple and its regulations. Purity is another one. God has chosen David's tribe of Judah as the proper ruler, and the northern kingdom is not even mentioned. So in their minds, that's a tangent. And then obedience is highlighted often. Some of the stories that chronicler adds highlights God's power to emphasize his trust in him and his justice. So there's clearly an emphasis in the book. When you get to Solomon's reign, he's got 2 major things. One chapter to talk about him getting started. Then he's got 3 chapters on the construction of the temple. And then about 3 more chapters on the dedication of the temple.
Wow.
Yeah. And then just some more activities of Solomon. But once again, the core of it is basically the temple.
The temple, really.
Yeah. So I wanted you to see that makes it real clear. Then here's all your kings of Judah. Okay. And then the Chronicles has a really good explanation as to why the exile took place. It says, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on the dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God until the wrath of God arose against his people. Now, I skipped a bunch of stuff, but you can see the clear, he's given a very good explanation as to why God did it. And remember, that's the purpose for Chronicles. He wants them to know God had a reason for taking you guys to exile. He also highlights that the Babylonians had no compassion, how they dashed their little ones against the rocks and stuff like that. They took the treasures and burnt the temple, the rest of them. But Cyrus let his people go back. That one is another big emphasis in the book. So all of those things I think are important. It's interesting how the book of Chronicles pictures the Babylonian exile. So we just read a portion of Chronicles. Kings, when it talks about it, it basically just goes through events and tells the events of what took place.
I see.
Yeah, here's a good example. So here's Chronicles, and we read, here I'll read verse 14, the yellow part. Furthermore, the officials and the priests of the people were unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations, and they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers. There's that passage I read already, because he had compassion on his people in his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people until there was no remedy. See, you can see that. It makes it clear. God almost didn't have any other option. These guys were so wicked that they weren't listening. He needed to do something. All right. Now, look what Kings talks about. Okay. For through the anger of the Lord, this came about in Jerusalem, and Judah did he cast them out of his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now, watch this. In the 19th year of his reign, the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his armies, against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So the city was under siege until the 11th year of the king Zedekiah. Do you see? He's basically just going through telling exactly what the events were that took place. So you can see there a good difference between how the books picture this.
You're kind of getting commentary almost in Chronicles. You're kind of getting an explanation. I mean, I think it's totally fair what you're saying, that it's a theological reading of this. Of the history in a way. Yeah.
Chronicles tells why God did it. Kings tells more of what God did. So it's really interesting, I think. All right, here's the conclusions. There was clearly a different purpose for Chronicles. What is it?
Well, like we just said, it's theological, right? I mean, I think that's a good term. You used, the theology of hope.
Okay.
But that's probably a very necessary message for people coming back to the land. It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy to rebuild and do all these things to kind of get the nation back to where it was, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's it's a fascinating way to kind of connect back to your history and explain how you got where you are.
Yeah. Okay. Number 2, the chronicler emphasizes themes that would encourage the post-exilic Israelite, like temple, purity, the kings that were obedient and stuff like that. So
I would imagine even just knowing you're part of the remnant would also be part of that.
Yeah.
Like you're one of the ones that's supposed to be here.
And that God wasn't done with you yet.
Yeah.
The post-exilic date is really important to the book, because otherwise I don't think you'd understand why is there this totally different view of the history. So if you don't know that the date is later, it doesn't really make much sense. So I think that's crucial. All right, here's our questions.
Okay.
Why was King David pictured as the ideal king in the book of Chronicles?
Probably because of the connection to worship, I think, is a theme in Chronicles. And that was something that we see, especially like in Kings, is like those kings are being graded on whether or not they're good or bad kings. A big part of that is whether or not they allowed worship of other gods or not. Did they get rid of it? So I would think kind of David is a model in that sense. And so Chronicles is kind of putting him in that spot again.
Okay. And that sin of Bathsheba isn't even mentioned in this time. Because again, in Chronicler's mind, that wasn't important. What it was important is David was a good king, and God's going to use him to get the people where they need to go. Okay. What key ideas were brought about in the Chronicler's picture of Israel's history?
Well, certainly the temple is going to be a big thing coming out.
Good.
And again, return to like right worship.
Good. Good.
Sounds like there's an element here too of kind of explaining the severity of the punishment.
Yeah, and why?
That it was, and why? Like that it was necessary.
Yeah, good. That was good. All right. How does the date relate to the purpose of the Book of Chronicles?
Well, yeah, you've got to. I mean, we just hit this, but that really tells you why we're getting a retelling of the history.
Yep.
I think if you don't know that, like you said, if you're just reading straight, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, it's going to be a little jarring, I would think. Or you may just skip it. Like you may start seeing the same stuff and think, well, I don't, without that knowledge of kind of the perspective and how it's being kind of recast in a way, it may be difficult to pick up on some of the purposeful, not even really like differences. I mean, I guess we'd call them differences, but some of the things that are changed on purpose.
Yep. Yeah. And I think starting with that, if you're ever going to get discouraged and want to quit reading the Book of Chronicles, Chronicles, it starts off with 9 chapters of history, a genealogy. Right. Now, but why are those there, Tyler?
I was thinking about that. I kind of wonder if maybe that's another encouragement to the remnant to kind of show like not only your roots in this land and kind of where you've come from, but that like you are part of this now.
Good.
You're an important part of this history.
Yep, I agree. All right, number 4. How do the differences between Chronicles and Kings affect inspiration or the authority of Scripture?
Yeah, that's a big one, I would think. I mean, I think like some of the things we saw, there's differences in numbers, which we probably need to hold on to loosely anyway.
Okay.
At least a few of those, differences on the chart, I kind of noticed. I don't know if you said it or not, but I noticed on there that some of it is just different ways of reckoning.
Yeah.
Reckoning a number. Yeah. How would you count this? And we're always going to have a distance from the ancient world and how numbers were thought of. So that's not something to probably hold on too closely. But I think another good point you brought up in this was theological development and kind of as your understanding of the world and how God works gets more complex.
Okay.
You might start understanding things in the past a little bit differently.
Okay.
And it's, I mean, I think we could even say some of these things are just clarifying.
Yeah.
They're bringing some clarity, maybe.
And I'd say one other thing is just because he's picking and choosing the things he wants to put in there doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just that he has a totally different purpose for writing it. And I'd say it's very similar to the Gospels, where you'll have you'll have multiple stories of the same events and just put together differently, and some will sound a little different. So.
Well, and something Dr. Gertner has I've kind of picked up from him is that it's important for us to remember, especially if we're using this kind of metaphor back to the Gospels, is that a lot of people who were reading the Gospels originally probably already had the letters running around their churches, Paul's letters. They were somewhat, aware of who Jesus was, but these Gospels are really telling them a more particular story. And that makes a lot of sense when you have all these narratives about Jesus and they always end on a question. Who is this? Who is this that does these things? And the original readers would have been like, we know, it's the Son of God. Like, we know everything that he did. So all that to say, like, it's important for us to keep that in mind, to hold on to that as well, that this was written to people who had another context as well, you know, and they had some understandings of all this stuff,
Good. Well, that's Chronicles. It took us.
That's Chronicles.
It took us one week to do this one. When Kings and Samuel took us forever, I think.
That's true. Yeah, but this is good. And hopefully this is a good encouragement to people that you can get stuck in the first 9 chapters, and it may be hard to read, but these are also, I think sometimes what we miss in church is that you can read fast. You can read slow and you can read fast. And it's good to get a big overview of how sometimes whole books work, so that like, if you're getting hung up on something, like it's okay. It's okay if like you don't totally understand it. Just keep going and read and try to get the whole big picture.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, that we've got, I think it's we're going to do, I think what we're going to try to do is do Psalms and Proverbs and the wisdom literature next. Okay. So that'll be coming, and so we'll have that for next week.
That sounds good to me. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you, Tyler.